Okay, so one of the most important concepts of westward expansion is definitely going to be the Homestead Act of 1865. Here's a quick video which is going to explain what the Homestead Act of 1865 was. Here we go. 4 minutes and 14 seconds.
We had a motley array of neighbors. On one side, a German who could scarce speak English, married to a Bohemian who could speak little English and no German. On another side, a family of Swedes fresh from the old country. On an adjoining farm, a Scotsman with a Missouri wife. Nearby, a family from Iowa, another family from Illinois. Some old, some young, some illiterate, some well-educated, yet all engaged in the same enterprise.
Enterprise is a fancy word for kind of business or interest, okay? They're all in the same interest of moving west. But what they're trying to show you is that it doesn't matter, it comes from all walks of life. Some people could read, some were Americans, some were from other countries, specifically Europe, okay? It's easy to remember they come from Europe because the majority of the people in the Midwest are going to be they're going to be white, okay? Now, it's important to understand that in Europe, the way it's set up, it's an old school system where the very, very rich are the only ones that own land. Okay? Like lords and knights. Have you heard of that kind of old school kind of stuff? Have you ever seen the movie Braveheart and stuff like that? Those people had very little land. They come here, they get to pick the land they want for $10, and so you can't beat it. Okay? So let's continue.
As more and more railroads expanded into the West, an intense competition between them began. Settlers were sought who would provide business for their freight trains and buy the land the railroads had been given as government subsidies.
Okay. Because the government wants to push forward with this concept of manifest destiny, it is going to really try to help move people over there. And so they gave land to the railroad companies because the government's not going to be the one that's going to build those railroads. Okay? And so they'll say, okay, Union Pacific, you have 100 miles stretch widthwise, north to south, all the way from, from whatever point all the way into California. Okay? Now, it's going to be very expensive for the railroad companies to build those things. You have a lot of guys that have to work, a lot of money spent in materials. It's going to cost a lot of money to feed them, to house them. And so what the railroad companies are going to do is they only need maybe 10 miles, right? 5 miles on this side of the railroad, 5 miles on this side, and that's way too much anyways. Probably a mile would do. And so the extra 90 miles can be then sold, and they make the profit, and they take that profit and they use it to pay the workers, to house them and to feed them and the materials. Does that make sense? Okay? Continuing. Here we go.
You can lay track to the Garden of Eden, said the head of the Northern Pacific, but what good is it if the only inhabitants are Adam and Eve? Western states also contended with one another for new residents. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres of public land to any person who filed a claim, paid a $10 fee, and agreed to work the property for 5 years. In the 1870s, Kansas grew by more than 500,000 people.
That's 500,000.
Nebraska's population quadrupled.
Quadruple means it increased 4 times.
200 Scottish families settled on the Kansas-Nebraska border. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society lured Jews from Eastern Europe to Oregon, Colorado, Kansas, the Dakotas. German, Russian Mennonites, Swedish, Dutch, French, Bohemian, Irish, and Norwegian families were soon scattered across the plains.
In the villages of Europe, you might be only a few steps away from your neighbors. Certainly within hearing distance, you could hear the village's church bells ringing on a Sunday morning. Suddenly here they were isolated many miles from neighbors. and from villages with long periods of time between any kind of interaction. They had wind sickness, they called it, from the constant blowing of the wind. They planted trees around their houses not simply for the shade or for the beauty, but to protect them from the immensity of the landscape.
They started towns like Lindsborg and Hofnungstal, New Alexandervall and Dannebrog, some with the same street plans as their old villages in Europe. And they planted wheat they had brought along from as far away as Russia. It flourished as no other domestic crop ever had before on the semi-arid plains, and would one day help make the United States the agricultural wonder of the world.
The men had farmed in many cases most of their lives. They had to struggle against roots and rocks and all these things that made farming difficult. They looked around them here, and there were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres without a root or a rock. They could put their plow in the ground and go miles and miles straight ahead without worrying about a hill. This was...
Okay, this area located in the center of the United States are known as the Great Plains. When something's plain, it's just normal, right? And so plains means that they're very, very flat, okay? And there's very, very scarce, which means there's not very many trees, okay? Now, that's important because the majority of houses are going to have some sort of wood frame in them. But because they have no wood, because there's such little trees, there's so few trees around, they're going to have to use sod, and we're going to go over sod in a little bit. But you'll see. I'm sorry, I should have just let y'all see that.
Grass, ground, earth that had never been turned in all of history, except maybe by a buffalo's horn. They said the first time a plow went through that ground, it sounded like the opening of a giant zipper from the grassroots tearing as the plow went through it. To them, this was a dream come true.
Last video, because there were so few trees around, they were forced to use what they had, and so they're going to build sod houses, okay? And so this little quick 42-second clip is going to show you how this process is done.
As people settled further west, there were not enough trees to build log cabins. These homesteaders chose to build their houses out of prairie sod. The roots from the prairie plants held the soil together very tightly and could be used to make sod bricks. Using a plow or sod cutter, the homesteaders would cut the sod into large pieces. These pieces were placed on top of one another, just as bricks are laid for a house today. The sod homes were very comfortable. They were warm in the winter and cool in the summer. These homes were often called soddies.
Okay, and so that was basically the Homestead Act and the sod houses. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at chrisdeleon@sbcisd.net.